Most men give a gift and let it go. I gave away a piece of myself and watched my own family hand the thank you card to somebody else. Most men donate blood and forget about it by lunch. I donated a kidney to save my brother's life, and 18 months later, I sat at his anniversary dinner and listened to his wife tell 40 people it was her cousin who saved him. I didn't say a word. I just picked up my fork and kept eating, because I already knew exactly how this story was going to end. It wasn't going to end that night. It was going to end when I decided it did. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one takes a while to unfold, and every minute of it matters. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Hit that like button, and if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. You're going to want to hear how this one plays out. Here, let me back up. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 61 years old. I live in a town called Pine Bluff, about 40 minutes outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, in a house I bought in 1994 for $81,000 and paid off in full 11 years ago. I drive a 2006 Ford F-250, dark green, 218,000 miles on it, and I still change my own oil every 3,000 miles because that's what my father taught me, and I never saw a reason to stop. For 34 years I worked as a machinist at a plant that made parts for industrial pumps. I retired 4 years ago with a pension that isn't fancy but pays the bills, and I spend my time now rebuilding small engines for neighbors, coaching the 8 and under baseball team at the community field on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and keeping a garden that my late wife Carol started 20 years ago and that I've never had the heart to let go fallow. I am not a dramatic man. I never have been. Carol used to tease me that I could deliver the worst news in the world, and it would sound like I was reading off a grocery list. I don't raise my voice. I don't slam doors. When people wrong me, my first instinct isn't to fight. It's to go quiet, watch, and figure out exactly what's true before I say a single word about it. Some people mistake that for weakness. I've learned, over 61 years, that quiet men are usually the last ones anybody sees coming. My father was a machinist too, at the same plant, 31 years before me, and he used to say a thing that stuck with me my whole life. Walter, a man who explains himself too fast is usually still figuring out what happened. Wait until you know, then say it once, and mean every word. I buried that man in 1997, and I've carried that sentence with me into every hard year since. Through Carol's diagnosis, through her funeral, through raising Emily alone for the back half of her teenage years, and through everything I'm about to tell you. I don't say much. But when I finally do say something, people tend to remember it. I keep a small workshop off the back of my garage, a workbench my father built with his own hands in 1968, a pegboard of tools organized by size the way he taught me, and a radio that only picks up 2 stations clearly. Most evenings you'll find me out there with a lawnmower engine or a neighbor's snowblower spread out in pieces, because there's something about putting a broken thing back together, methodically, one bolt at a time, that settles a man's mind. I mention this because it matters to how I handled everything that follows. I don't solve problems with my fists or my voice. I solve them the way I solve a seized-up engine, slow, patient, and with every part laid out where I can see it clearly before I touch a single one. I have one brother, Russell, 2 years younger than me. Growing up, Russell was the golden one, the one who talked easy, made friends fast, always had some scheme that was going to make him rich. I loved him anyway, still do, in the complicated way you love a brother who's spent his whole life a half step ahead of trouble and a half step behind responsible. Russell married a woman named Deborah about 9 years ago, his second marriage, and Deborah came with a big personality, 3 grown stepchildren from a prior relationship who eventually became close enough to Russell to call him Dad, and an absolute talent for making sure every room she walked into knew exactly who she was. I need you to hold on to one thing, because it matters more than anything else I'm going to tell you tonight. Back in the spring of 2019, before any of what I'm about to describe happened, I quietly went through a full medical workup at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Blood typing, tissue matching, a stack of paperwork 3 inches thick. I told almost nobody. I didn't tell Russell. I told Carol, because I never kept anything from Carol, and I told my daughter Emily, because I needed someone to drive me home after. That's it. 2 people. I had a reason for the secrecy, and you're going to understand it by the end of this story. For now, just remember, there is a paper trail. There is always a paper trail with me. I built machines for a living. I know that if something matters, you document it. Now let me tell you about the years before all this went sideways, because I want you to understand what we had before I tell you how it got taken from me. Russell and Deborah lived about 20 minutes from me, out past the county line, in a nice brick house with a pool Russell was always half finished fixing. Deborah's 3 kids from her first marriage, Tyler, who was 26 by the time this story starts, Madison, 23, and the youngest, Colt, who was 19, had grown up calling Russell Dad since they were teenagers, and over time, they started calling me Uncle Walt, which always warmed something in my chest, because I never had a son, just my daughter Emily, and having those 3 kids treat me like family meant something. Sunday dinners were the backbone of our family. Every single Sunday, rain or shine, we gathered at Russell and Deborah's place, or sometimes mine, and there'd be 12, 14 people crowded around tables pushed together, kids running through the yard, somebody always burning something on the grill. Carol used to make her buttermilk biscuits, and Deborah would bring some elaborate dessert from a bakery in town because Deborah didn't believe in baking from scratch when you could buy something that looked more impressive. I never held that against her. Different people show love different ways. I loved those Sundays. After Carol passed in 2017, cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the funeral, those Sunday dinners were the only thing that kept me tethered some weeks. Russell would call me every Sunday morning, just to make sure I was coming, just to say, "See you at 2, brother." That's the kind of relationship we had. Whatever else was true about Russell, and there was plenty else, he showed up for me when Carol died in a way that I will never forget as long as I live. The month Carol was in hospice, Russell drove to my house every single evening after his shift, sat with me on the back porch, and didn't say much of anything most nights. Just sat there so I wouldn't have to sit alone. The night she passed, at 4:12 in the morning, he was the second phone call I made, right after the funeral home, and he was at my kitchen table before the sun came up, making coffee I didn't ask for and didn't want, but drank anyway because he'd made it. I tell you that not to excuse anything that happened later, but because I need you to understand, this wasn't a story about a brother I never trusted. It's a story about a brother I trusted completely, which is exactly what made the rest of it cut as deep as it did. Tyler was the one who reminded me most of myself at that age. Quiet around strangers, good with his hands, more comfortable under the hood of a truck than in a room full of people. When he turned 16, he bought a 1998 Chevy S10 off a farmer 2 towns over for $400, and every Saturday for most of a summer, the 2 of us had that truck up on ramps in my driveway, replacing a carburetor, then a starter, then half the brake lines, while I taught him the same things my father taught me. Madison used to bring us lemonade out to the driveway and sit on the tailgate doing her homework, asking me questions about engines she didn't actually care about just to be part of it. Colt was younger, barely into his teens back then, and he used to follow me around the garden on Saturday mornings, helping Carol pull weeds, more interested in the earthworms than the tomatoes, but happy just to be near us. Those 3 kids, over 9 years, became as much mine as Emily was, in every way that matters except the biological one, and I loved them the way you love kids who chose to love you back even though nothing obligated them to. I tell you all of this because it's the foundation the betrayal was built on top of. This wasn't a cold, distant family where a slight like this might barely register. This was a family I had given 20 years of Sundays to, a family I had bled for, quite literally as it turned out, and that context is exactly why what happened next hollowed me out the way it did. So when Russell's kidneys started failing in the fall of 2018, I didn't think twice. I didn't announce it. I didn't make it a family conversation. I went and got tested, quietly, the way I do most things that matter. Here's what almost nobody in my family knows to this day, and what I'm about to tell you is the whole engine of this story, so stay with me here, because it's important. I was the donor. In June of 2019, I gave Russell one of my kidneys, 6-hour surgery, 5 days in the hospital, 6 weeks before I could lift more than 10 pounds. I told the family a modified version of the truth, that Russell had found a donor through the transplant registry, a match nobody expected, a stroke of luck. I asked the surgical team, and Russell, and Deborah, to keep my name out of it. I told Russell I didn't want a fuss. I told him I didn't want to be thanked at every Thanksgiving for the rest of my life, that I just wanted him alive, and healthy, and for us to go back to being brothers, not a patient and his benefactor. Russell agreed. He hugged me in that hospital room, tears running down a face that hadn't cried in front of me since our father's funeral in 1997, and he said, "Nobody will ever hear it from me, Walt. This stays between us." I believed him. That was my first mistake, though I didn't know it yet. The surgery worked. Russell recovered fully. Within a year he was back to fishing, back to work, back to being the loud, laughing center of every Sunday dinner, and for a long while, it seemed like Russell had kept his word. Nobody mentioned the donor. Life moved on. Now here's where things started to shift, and I want you to feel this the way I felt it. Slowly, in pieces, none of them alarming enough on their own to make me say anything. About a year after the surgery, at a 4th of July cookout, I overheard Deborah telling a neighbor, in that big, warm, storytelling voice of hers, about how we almost lost Russell, and then this incredible thing happened. My cousin Ben, God bless him, turned out to be a match, and he gave Russell back his life. I remember standing by the cooler with a beer in my hand, and I remember the exact temperature of that beer going from cold to nothing in my grip, as I stood there and listened to my brother's wife credit her cousin Ben, a man I had met exactly twice in 9 years, with saving my brother's life. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe Russell had told her a cover story that got tangled up somewhere. Maybe she'd confused something. I let it go. Then it happened again at Thanksgiving, 2021. Deborah's sister asked, in front of the whole table, whatever happened to that cousin who was such a hero? And Deborah said, without missing a beat, Ben still calls to check on Russell. Isn't that something? A man barely knows you, and he gives you a piece of himself. I looked at Russell. Russell looked down at his plate and reached for the gravy. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a story. Somebody had built a story, and my brother was letting it stand, and I was sitting right there, at that table, having given him one of my own kidneys, watching my sacrifice get repackaged with somebody else's name on the label. I want to be fair here, because I think that matters, and because I spent a long time being fair before I did anything else. I told myself Russell was embarrassed. I told myself maybe he never actually corrected Deborah's version, because it was easier than reopening old wounds, easier than explaining to his stepkids why their real uncle had been erased from the most important moment of his medical life. I gave him chance after chance to pull me aside and say, "Walt, I need to fix this. I don't know how it got so far." I gave him 2 full years of chances. I actually tried. Once. Directly. It was a Tuesday evening in January, about a year and a half after the surgery, and I caught Russell alone in his garage. No Deborah, no kids, just the 2 of us, and a space heater, and a case of beer between us like old times. I said, as gently as I know how to say anything, "Russ, I keep hearing Deborah tell people it was Ben. I think it's time we corrected that, don't you?" Russell wouldn't look at me. He turned a wrench over in his hands like it required his full attention and said, "It's complicated, Walt. Deb's proud of her family, and Ben's been good to her, and it's easier to let it be what it is. You said yourself you didn't want the attention." I told him there's a difference between not wanting attention and watching somebody else collect credit for what I did. He said he'd talk to her. He never did, or if he did, it didn't take, because 2 weeks later I heard the exact same story, word for word, at Madison's birthday party. The second time I tried was with Deborah directly, that same February, at her kitchen counter while she was unloading a dishwasher, and I was waiting on Russell to come down so we could go look at a used tiller I was thinking about buying. I said carefully, "Deborah, I don't think you know the full story about Russell's kidney. I think somewhere along the way it got mixed up with Ben." She didn't even pause with the plates. She said, "Walt, it's just a story we tell. Figure it out. It's not that deep," and moved on to the silverware drawer like I'd asked her opinion on the weather. I remember standing there in that kitchen, holding a coffee mug I never actually drank from, feeling something in my chest go cold in a way it hadn't gone cold since the week Carol died. Figure it out. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, standing at her counter, "All right, Deborah, I will." He never took a single one. Instead, what I watched happen over those 2 years was worse than silence. It was replacement. Tyler, Deborah's oldest, the one who used to call me Uncle Walt and ask me to help him rebuild a carburetor on his first truck, started introducing Cousin Ben at family gatherings as basically family, the guy who saved Dad. Madison put together a photo slideshow for Russell's 60th birthday, and there, right in the middle of it, was a picture of Ben, who I later learned had visited Russell exactly once during his entire recovery, with a caption that read, "The reason we still have you, Dad." Colt, the youngest, started a small fundraiser page online for a kidney foundation, in honor of Ben's generosity, and raised almost $4,000 off the story of a man who had donated nothing but a hospital visit and a fruit basket. I sat through all of it. I watched a story get built, brick by brick, on the exact spot where the truth used to stand, and I said nothing, because I am not a dramatic man, and because I needed to understand what I was actually looking at before I responded to it. What I was looking at, I eventually figured out, wasn't really about Ben at all. Ben, from what I could tell, barely understood the size of the credit he was getting. He seemed like a decent, oblivious guy who'd been swept along by somebody else's narrative. This was about Deborah. Deborah's cousin worked in finance, drove a car that cost more than my house did when I bought it, and had connections in Knoxville that Deborah, by all appearances, was very interested in cultivating for Tyler, who'd just graduated and was hunting for a job in the same industry. A hero story about her own family opened doors. A hero story about her husband's brother, a retired machinist who drove a 19-year-old truck and coached Little League, opened nothing. I was inconvenient to the narrative, so I got quietly written out of it. I remember the exact night it crystallized for me. It was a Sunday dinner in March, and Deborah was telling a new neighbor the whole story again. Ben, the miracle, the hospital, the 6-hour surgery, and I sat there at that same table where Carol used to serve her biscuits, and I felt something in me go very, very still. Not angry. Not yet. Just still. The way water goes, still, right before it turns to ice. I looked at Russell. He wouldn't meet my eyes, and I thought, not yet, but I know exactly what I'm going to do about this. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. It costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit that like button and drop your thoughts down in the comments. I want to hear what you'd have done in my shoes. I didn't confront anybody that night. I didn't confront anybody the next week or the next month. I want you to understand something about how I operate, because it's going to explain everything that comes after this. I don't fight fire with fire. I fight fire with paperwork, patience, and time, because those three things have never once failed me in 61 years, and they weren't going to fail me now. The first thing I did was call Vanderbilt's medical records department. I requested a full, certified copy of every document related to my surgery in June of 2019, the donor consent forms, the surgical reports, the post-operative care records, everything with my name, my signature, and the transplant coordinator's name attached. It took 3 weeks and cost me $41 in processing fees. When that envelope came in the mail, I sat at my kitchen table and read through every page twice, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in 2 years. Proof. Undeniable. Dated. Notarized proof. The second thing I did was call the transplant coordinator who had overseen my case, a woman named Renata Ford who I hadn't spoken to since my 6-month follow-up in 2020. I explained the situation to her, carefully, calmly, no drama in my voice, just facts. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've thought about often since. Mr. Hensley, I remember your case very specifically, because it's rare that a donor asks us to keep his name private. Most people want credit. You didn't want any. She agreed, entirely within the bounds of what she was allowed to share given that I was the patient of record on my own side of the file, to provide a letter on hospital letterhead confirming the basic facts of the donation and my role in it, addressed to whoever I specified. The third thing I did was reach out to my daughter, Emily. Emily is 32, works as a paralegal at a firm in Knoxville, and had been the only other person besides Carol who knew the truth from day one, because she'd driven me to and from every single appointment. I told her what had been happening at family dinners for 2 years. I watched her face go through about 4 different emotions in the space of 10 seconds, landing finally on something that looked a lot like the expression I probably wore myself. She said, "Dad, why didn't you say something sooner?" And I told her the truth, because I wanted to be sure it wasn't a mistake before I called it what it actually is. Emily helped me with the fourth thing, which took the longest and mattered the most. She helped me pull together, quietly, over the following 2 months, a complete written and photographic timeline, the hospital admission records with dates, my surgical scar, which I had Emily photograph, because a scar doesn't lie about which side of a body it's on, My post-surgery prescriptions filled at the Pine Bluff pharmacy under my name, and even the muscle relaxant medication I'd taken for 6 weeks after, all of it stamped, dated, official. Nothing manufactured, nothing exaggerated, just the truth, organized the way I'd organize a set of machine specifications, because the truth, when you lay it out cleanly enough, doesn't need me to raise my voice for it. It speaks for itself. There was a sixth thing, smaller than the rest but important to me personally, and it happened almost by accident. In April, at a hardware store in town, I ran into Ben's father, Deborah's uncle, a soft-spoken man named Harold who I'd met exactly once, at Deborah and Russell's wedding. We got to talking over a bin of hex bolts, the way strangers do in hardware stores, and somehow the conversation drifted to family, and Harold mentioned, with obvious pride, "You know, my grandson Ben, he's the one who saved your brother, isn't that something?" I looked at Harold for a long moment and I saw, in his face, a decent old man who genuinely believed what he was telling me, who had probably told that story to friends of his own, at his own dinner tables, for 2 years. I didn't correct him that day. I wasn't ready yet, and it wasn't Harold's fight. But I remember standing in that aisle thinking about how far this story had travelled, past our family, past our town, into the pride of an old man in a hardware store who had nothing to do with any of it. That's when I understood the scope of what needed correcting wasn't just one dinner table. It was a whole constellation of people who now believed something false, because nobody had ever been willing to spend the 10 seconds it takes to say the true thing out loud. The fifth thing I did was the one that mattered most, and I want to explain why I did it, because on its face it might sound harsh. I had, 4 years earlier, updated my will to leave a specific piece of property, 6 acres of land out past the county line that had been in the Hensley family for 3 generations, land Russell had always loved, land he used to talk about building a cabin on someday, jointly to Russell and to Emily. It was meant as a gift, a brother's gift. In February, quietly, through my attorney, a good man named Philip Castellano, who I've used for 30 years, I amended that will. I didn't disinherit Russell entirely. I'm not a cruel man, and none of this was ever about cruelty. But I removed the land as a joint gift and restructured it so that it would pass entirely to Emily, with a letter to be read alongside the will, explaining exactly why, in my own words, dated and signed. I wanted there to be a record, permanent and undeniable, of exactly when I made this decision and precisely why, should anyone ever ask. I also, and this is the part Emily helped me think through most carefully, cancelled the automatic monthly transfer I'd been quietly making into a savings account for Colt's college expenses since he was 14 years old. $11,000 over 5 years. Nobody but Colt and I knew about it. A private arrangement between an uncle and a nephew he loved. I didn't do this out of spite toward Colt. I did it because I needed, for my own dignity, to stop quietly funding a family that had built a monument to somebody else out of my own body. I told myself I'd revisit it once things were made right, not before. Through all of this, the records requests, the letter from Renata Ford, the will amendment, the quiet redirection of money, I kept showing up to Sunday dinners. I kept my face calm. I kept eating my portion of whatever was on the table, laughing at Russell's jokes, letting Deborah tell her stories about her cousin Ben one more time, and one more time after that. Inside, I was not angry. I want to be precise about that, because anger burns hot and clouds your aim. What I was accurate. I knew exactly what had happened, exactly who was responsible, and exactly how I intended to make the truth visible, in a way that nobody in that family would ever be able to argue with or explain away again. I'm not angry. I'm just accurate. I said that to myself, quietly, more times than I can count, over those 2 months. If you're still with me, hit subscribe. Trust me, you don't want to miss where this lands. The opportunity I'd been waiting for arrived on its own, the way these things usually do if you're patient enough to let them. Russell and Deborah's 10th wedding anniversary was coming up in September, and Deborah, never one to let an occasion pass quietly, had rented out the back room of a steakhouse in Knoxville and invited close to 60 people, family, neighbors, Russell's old co-workers, Deborah's whole extended clan, including, of course, cousin Ben, flying in from Charlotte for the occasion. There was going to be a slideshow. There was going to be toasts. Deborah had, according to Madison, specifically planned a segment of the evening honoring the people who helped keep this family whole. and everyone understood exactly who the centerpiece of that segment would be. I RSVP'd yes. I bought a new shirt, and I brought with me a manila envelope sealed that I placed inside my jacket pocket before I left the house that night, along with copies, 4 of them, printed at the library 2 days earlier, tucked inside my truck's glove box, just in case one envelope wasn't enough to make the point stick. The dinner went exactly as Deborah had planned it, right up until the moment it didn't. Dinner was served. Toasts were given. Tyler gave a warm one about his mum and Russell's marriage. Madison teared up talking about how Russell had shown up for every one of her school events like a real father. Then the lights dimmed and the slideshow started. Photos scrolling across a screen set up against the back wall. Russell and Deborah's wedding, birthdays, holidays. And then, there it was, the same photo from Russell's 60th, cousin Ben smiling next to Russell's hospital bed. The caption reading, "The reason we still have you." A murmur of warm approval moved through the room. Deborah stood, glass in hand, and gestured for Ben to stand too, and began, in that voice built for rooms exactly this size, to tell the story. Russell's kidneys failing, the desperate search, and then, this incredible man, who didn't even hesitate, who gave a piece of himself to save my husband. I stood up. I didn't shout. I want you to understand that. I stood up the way I'd stand up at a machine floor to check a reading, calm, unhurried, and I said, "Deborah, before you finish that story, I think there's a version of it the room deserves to hear." The room went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when everybody senses something is about to happen, that they'll be talking about for years. I pulled the envelope from my jacket. I walked to the front, past 60 faces I'd known most of my life, and I set the first document on the table in front of the screen where everyone could see it. The certified surgical report from Vanderbilt University Medical Center, June 14, 2019. Donor, Walter James Hensley. I set down the second document, Renata Ford's letter, on hospital letterhead, confirming, in plain clinical language, that I had been the living kidney donor for patient Russell Hensley. I said, "Ben, I want to say, I don't think you ever claimed to be something you weren't. I think you got handed a story that was easier to tell than the true one, and I don't hold that against you." Ben, to his credit, looked as stunned as anyone in that room. Then I looked at Russell. I said, "You told me in that hospital room that nobody would ever hear it from you. You kept that promise in the strangest way I've ever seen. You let somebody else's name take my place instead of just staying quiet." I looked at Deborah. I said, "Figure it out." Her own words echoed back at her. The exact phrase she'd used on me 8 months earlier, when I'd tried, gently, one final time before I started my quiet work, to raise the subject with her privately, and she'd waved me off with, "Walt, it's just a story we tell. Figure it out, it's not that deep." I let that phrase sit in the room for a moment. Then I said, "I did, I figured it out." I told the room, briefly, without cruelty, the actual timeline, the testing in the spring of 2019, the surgery in June, my request for privacy, and the 2 years of watching that privacy get repurposed into somebody else's spotlight. I didn't raise my voice once. Philip, my attorney, had prepared, at my request, one more document, which I did not read aloud, but which I handed directly to Russell in a sealed envelope, the amended will, and the letter explaining, plainly, why the family land would now pass to Emily alone. Not as a punishment, I told him quietly, just between the two of us, stepping slightly away from the microphone, but because a man deserves to know the whole truth about where he stands with his family before he plans anything around a story that was never true. Deborah's face did something I will remember until the day I die, that slow collapse from performance to panic, the practiced warmth draining out of it in real time as 60 guests, including her own cousin, looked at her with an entirely new understanding of who she was. She opened her mouth twice, and nothing came out either time. I have known that woman for 9 years, and I had never once, in all that time, seen her without something to say. Somewhere behind me I heard Harold, the old man from the hardware store, Ben's father, say quietly but clearly enough to carry, "Well, I'll be." 2 words, and somehow they landed harder in that room than anything I'd said all night, because Harold had no reason to lie and everyone there knew it. Russell stood up from his chair, slow, the way a man stands up when his legs aren't entirely sure they'll hold him, and he walked over and put his hand on my shoulder, in front of every single person in that room. He didn't say much. Russell was never a man for speeches, same as me. But he said, loud enough for the tables near us to hear, Walt gave me his kidney. My brother did that. Nobody else. 6 words that should have been said 2 years and 3 months earlier, finally spoken out loud in the one room where it mattered most. I didn't stay to watch the aftermath unfold in detail. I said what needed saying. I thanked the room for their time, and I walked out to my truck, the same 2006 Ford with 218,000 miles on it, and I drove home in the quiet dark, and for the first time in 2 years, my chest didn't feel heavy. Some men don't look powerful. They just are. And the ones who underestimate them always find out eventually, usually in front of the exact audience that mattered most. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Russell called me 3 days later, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't try to smooth anything over. He just said, I let it happen because it was easier, Walt, and I'm sorrier about that than I've been about anything in my life. I told him I believed him, and I meant it, and I told him the door wasn't closed, but it was going to take time, real time, for me to trust that he'd stand up for the truth the next time it was inconvenient to. Tyler drove out to my place the following Saturday, without calling first, and found me in the garage with a neighbor's lawnmower engine spread across the workbench. He stood in the doorway for a while before he said anything, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was 14. I put that picture in the slideshow, Uncle Walt. I picked that caption. I did that. I told him to come in and hand me the 9/16 socket, and while we worked on that engine together, the same way we'd worked on his old Chevy years before, I told him the whole real story, start to finish, no editing. By the time we finished the mower, it ran, and so, I think, did something between us that had been stalled for 2 years. Madison called Emily first, not me, and cried on the phone for 20 minutes, mortified about the slideshow, about the photo, about 2 years of a story she'd never once questioned, because it came from her mother's mouth, and she'd had no reason to doubt it. She came by a week later with a handwritten letter, actual pen and paper, apologizing in more detail than I ever needed, and I told her the same thing I told Tyler, that none of this was ever about punishing kids for a story the adults in their lives handed them. Colt sent me a text that just read, I'm sorry, Uncle Walt, that fund. Was that real all this time? I told him it was, and that it still could be, once some things got sorted between the adults in this story, because none of what happened was his fault to carry. Within a month, I'd reopened that account and made up the missed deposits, because a 19-year-old's education shouldn't be the casualty of his mother's pride. Ben called me too, about 2 weeks after the anniversary dinner, and I'll admit I wasn't expecting it. He apologized, awkwardly, clearly still working out in his own head how deep he'd been pulled into something he never asked to be the center of. I told him I didn't blame him, and I meant that. Some people get handed a spotlight they never auditioned for. What matters is what you do once you understand it isn't yours. Deborah, as far as I know, has not spoken to me since that night, and I've made my peace with that. Not every relationship survives the truth. Some were never built to. These days, I still coach the 8 and under team on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I still tend Carol's garden, and this year the tomatoes came in better than they have in 5 years. Emily and I have Sunday dinner together most weeks now, sometimes just the 2 of us, sometimes with Tyler or Colt joining, slowly, carefully, rebuilding something real out of the wreckage of something that wasn't. Russell and I talk. It's not what it was yet, but it's honest, and honest is a place you can actually build something on, which is more than I can say for the story Deborah spent 2 years constructing. I gave my brother a piece of my body once, quietly, without asking for a single word of thanks. It turns out the only thing I ever really wanted was for the truth to stay standing on its own 2 feet. It took me 2 years and 1 manila envelope, but I made sure it finally did. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment down below letting me know where you're watching from. I'll see you on the next one.